This is a collaborative effort between the Douglas County Historical Society, the Legacy of the Lakes Museum and Gardens, and the Runestone Museum Foundation here in Alexandria, Minnesota. And we also want to thank Alexandria Community Education for bringing us all together for this. So without further ado, let us talk about Gar. Garfield Arthur Wood was born December 4th, 1880 in Mapleton, Iowa. He was the third of 12 children born to Walter W. Wood and Elizabeth Burr Benton Wood. His father was of Welsh ancestry and his mother had English ancestry. Some sources give his mother's last name as Burr and others give it as Benton, so I put both here, and I did see some that also had both of her last names on there. Her family had come to Minnesota from out east to run a rail line between Duluth and the Twin Cities, and as an Iron Ranger, I can tell you I wish that rail line still existed because I hate driving. So Gar's father ran away at a young age to join the Union Navy during the Civil War, and he was somewhere between the ages of 13 and 17 when he did this, and he had to lie about his age, so that's why nobody's really sure how old he really was when he went ahead and joined up. After the war, he had a number of odd jobs. Eventually, he met Elizabeth, and they were married in 1875 in Forest Lake, Minnesota. And when Gar was born in 1880, Walter was running a small grocery store in Iowa. Gar was named after the president, James Garfield, and the vice president, Chester Arthur, who were in office at the time in 1880 that he had been born. Sometime between Gar's birth in 1880 and his brother's Winfield's birth in 1885, so most likely 1883, the family moved to Osakis, Minnesota on the Todd County side. I was unable to find the exact address, but Walter is listed on the veteran schedule on the Todd County side for 1890, which you can see here. And it doesn't list their address, but that's how you can tell that they were on the Todd County side, is because he's listed on the Todd County registers and not the Douglas County registers. Walter worked on the Great Northern Railroad during the winter months, and during the summer tourist season, he captained a steamship called the Manitoba. It was a steam paddle boat that took tourists around Lake Osakis. At the age of 8, Gar was already working hard. He made $40 a month as a dairy farmer. At the age of 12, he established himself as a fishing guide, taking tourists out on the lake for $1 a trip. When he was older, Gar joined his father on the Manitoba, piloting and doing mechanical work. And often races would break out between the ferry operators, particularly the ferry Merry Man. Gar would later describe those races, and in particular described his first one. The first boat race I ever took part in was on Lake Osakis. My father operated a ferry on that lake, and we had some great old times with it. Our ferry was named the Manitoba, and its only rival was the Merry Man, owned and run by Old West Man. Wes wouldn't give up the idea that his ferry boat, which was a wood burner like ours, was the faster of the two, and that someday he would catch Dad unawares and prove it. On one memorable trip across the lake, Wes caught us short of wood. His old boat was pushing us hard because we couldn't feed ours enough fuel. "Why don't you row that old tub in?" he jeered as he edged alongside. "I'm passin' you standin' still." "Blast his hide!" roared Dad. "Hey, you lads, give us a hand with this furniture. Bust her up and shove her into the firebox. We'll beat that old pirate if we have to tear up the deck." So we fed the fire with the chairs and tables, and though Old West pushed his boat for all she was worth, we beat him fair and square. I still feel the thrill of winning that race. The engines driving those paddle wheels fascinated me. I resolved right then that someday I was going to build race boats of my own. And I do believe that Gar would later say in the article that they didn't really go much faster than like 8 miles per hour, but that was really kind of the start and the spark of him wanting to race boats. In 1890, the census records show that the family moved to Duluth, Minnesota. Originally, Walter worked for Lakeside Land Company as a real estate developer, but soon got a job captaining Great Lakes freighters and tugs. Gar attended school at Lakeside Elementary, and at the age of 12, also gained a job with the U.S. government, working around a boatyard. By 1900, his occupation was listed as boatman on the census record. So you can see here, and I've kind of expanded it a little larger so you can see, it lists the whole family, and there you can see Gar was working as a boatman. I also like looking that his sister above him, Bessie, was working as a typewriter, which is kind of fun. And his brother was a machinist in the U.S. Navy. Gar continued to work on the boats for the government in the early 1900s for about $45 a month. It allowed him to experiment with speed and be on the water. As he describes, though, his first real job, which influenced his whole life, was thanks to a red-headed girl. Gar would run the engine of a boat as an army major who was trying to woo the girl took her on picnics around the lakes. And Gar would later describe those outings. In those days, there was no carburation system in gasoline engines. We used high-test gasoline and air valves. The power would drop as the engines were used, and usually after a few hours, they were pretty weak. You would have to keep the air valve closed. If you opened it, there was backfire. I decided that if I could get gasoline into the engine in conjunction with air, I could keep up power, so I experimented with a squirt can. I would open the air valves and squirt in gasoline, thus I had a crude equivalent of a modern carburetor. Those old type engines had their spark fixed. Advanced spark had not yet been invented, but by a system of trial and error, I discovered that by sticking a screwdriver between the spark can and the roller, advanced the spark and increased the power of the engine and made the boat run faster. According to Gar, his endeavors were successful. The major made headway with the girl, and he learned about marine engines. Later, Gar said, "I humbly thank the red-headed girl, and I hope that she lived happily ever after." In 1903, Gar attended the Armour Institute of Technology in Chicago. He studied for about a year, but then returned to Duluth and got a job at the Zenith Telephone Company. The Duluth City Directory showed that he had several different jobs for the next few years, including electrician, marine and electrical engineer, sales representative, and also a Minnesota Ford distributor. Automobiles continued to foster Gar's interest in speed, and in 1905 he was sued for driving negligently and running over a valuable fox terrier. Gar moved to St. Paul in 1908 and worked at a local Ford dealership. He supplemented his income from that by teaching at a vocational school, and he opened an automobile, electric, and novelty store called Gar Wood & Co. In 1910, he married Merlin M. Fellows, who he had met in Duluth when she was still in high school. She was the daughter of two osteopathic physicians and was drawn to Gar's creativity and resourcefulness. When she graduated high school in 1904, she attended the University of Minnesota, and she graduated from there with a BA in 1908. Upon their marriage, she taught school while Gar operated his own machine shop. And this photo here is of her in the 1930s outside of their Detroit home. Shortly after their marriage, Merlin and Gar were invited on a trip. We took our lives along and arrived in Dubuque in the morning. Some motor races were being held. As we were called alongside the dock, I saw a man tinkering with an engine of a race boat called the Leading Lady. When we ran past her, I asked the man in the boat if I could be of any help. He asked me aboard, and after a little while we had the engine running nicely and took her down the river in a race. The banks of the river seemed to fly past me. I had never gone so fast in my life. When we got back, whistles were blowing and people were cheering, and we suddenly found ourselves in the middle of an excited crowd. "You did that 10-mile run at 30 miles an hour," someone said. "You've broke the world's record." The thrill of breaking a world's record has never left me. Gar continued racing that boat, called the Leading Lady, for its owner, William P. Cleveland, winning his first race in 1911. The team won trophies on the Mississippi Valley Power Boats Association circuit, but lacked the funds that they needed to race seriously. Gar later built his first speedboat, the Little Leading Lady, for $40, which is pictured here. The boat went 34 miles per hour, and according to Gar, it won every race he ever entered it in. Gar was constantly looking for ways to supplement his income and now support his racing habit. In 1911, he was working as a lightning rod salesman. One day, he and Merlin were out looking for supplies when he came across a scene that would change his life forever. Two men were struggling to turn a hand crane to raise the bed of a fully loaded coal truck. Gar was convinced that if he could come up with a better way for the truck beds to be lifted, and he and Merlin agreed that they would invest their life savings, about $200, into Gar's design and prototype device. Gar was inspired by the hydraulic cylinder his father used for reversing the engine on the Manitoba on Lake Osakis all those years ago. He took that idea and ran with it. Wood approached the local Pierce Arrow truck distributor, Grant Waldrop, manager of the Waldrop Odell Motor Car Company, with a business proposition. Wood would design and construct a working prototype, and if it proved successful, Waldrop would supply the financing to put it into production. And here you can see a photo of what would eventually become the hoist from Gar Wood. Gar described the first test of the prototype. The owner of the truck and a group of other men who had been attending a party heard of our experiment one night and hurried into the garage. We were all ready for the final job. Most of them were top-hatted and in formal dress, but they climbed into the truck body and we started the hoist. It shot up too fast and rolled a dozen well-dressed gentlemen unceremoniously onto the floor. They took it good-naturedly enough, and there was an immediate demand for the advice. The truck owner himself would actually go on to order one for each of his coal trucks, and that was really just the beginning. Gar immediately protected his new invention by applying for a patent in 1912, which was eventually granted in 1915. The patent description was ironclad, with Gar accounting for every single nut and bolt in order to prevent copycats. Half of the patent was given to Grant Waldrop, who had promised to back Gar's manufacturing with a $5,000 loan. Gar regretted this for pretty much the rest of his career. His decision to expand so quickly and taking on a business partner wasn't something that he had really wanted to do when he thought about it. And it wasn't until 1930 that Waldrop agreed to sell his half of the hoist patent back to Gar for about $750,000, which is just a little over $12 million today. And honestly, from that point on, like, he retained tight control over his businesses until he retired, keeping over 3/4 of stocks when they went public for himself because he didn't like that he had to expand so quickly. Gar would move the business to Detroit. This was ostensibly to be closer to truck manufacturers, but there is also some idea that it might also have something to do with him wanting to get away from his business partner. Once in Detroit, he encouraged all of his brothers to take part in the business. The difference between his brothers and Waldrop was that he trusted his brothers implicitly, and the move allowed him to cautiously and slowly expand the business, which avoided another business loan that might take away from his control of the company. During World War I, Allied forces used an estimated 3,000 of Gar's hydraulic hoists to repair roads in the war zones. With the lifts, they were able to dump their loads in just 13 seconds, which is valuable time when you're in the middle of a war zone. And that contract with the government was very lucrative for Gar. So Gar was able to indulge in his passion for speedboats thanks to the success of the business and also his brothers taking on a greater role in it. He purchased Miss Detroit, the winner of the 1915 Gold Cup race in 1916. Chris Smith of later Chris Craft fame was the builder. So Miss Detroit had won the race, but the owners of it hadn't finished paying for it. And so they had this like auction at this club of this boat, and Gar just went to see what it was about and just decided to buy it. And people are like, who is this guy who's buying this boat? Like, how can he do that? But it was great because it sparked a working relationship between Gar and Chris Craft, or Chris Smith. Gar needed an experienced race boat builder, and Chris needed a customer who could pay for it. So it was kind of a match made in heaven for a while. They agreed that Gar would become the majority owner of C.C. Smith Boat and Engine Company. And actually, that relationship would last until about 1923. Before they split ways. So they built Miss Detroit 2, and in 1917 it won every race it was entered in, with Gar at the helm and J. Smith as the onboard mechanic. In 1918 they built Miss Detroit 3, and Gar had converted a Glenn Curtiss aircraft engine, and J. and Bernard Smith had designed a hull that would ride entirely out of water. Miss Detroit 3 won the 1918 Gold Cup and kept winning until the American Powerboat Association banned the use of aircraft engines in Gold Cup races. And it was said that, this was to just make it more fair and safe, but people felt that it was a direct move to stop Gar's winning streak. He just kept winning because of the designs of his boats, and so they wanted to stop that streak. And so, oh hey, new rule: can't have these aircraft engines in these boats. So, however, 1918 did turn out to be a good year for Gar because his son, Garfield Arthur Wood Jr., was born that same year. That was his only child. It was at this time that Gar decided to shift his focus entirely. He left the hoist business in the capable hands of and trustworthy hands of his brothers and focused on racing. The shift can be seen in the number of patents that Gar Wood applied for. Between 1912 and 1918, he applied for 18 patents that related to his hoist company. But from 1912 to 1945, of the 12 patents applied for, 12 of them, they all pertain to race boats, with the exception of a few that were innovations for the U.S. government during World War II. And I just want to note that even though Gar put his brothers in charge of the business, they were also actively involved in his racing. As you can see in this photo here, they all lined up for a photo at one of the Gold Cup regattas. It's described as a rare photograph to have them all lined up like that. And Gar is the second from the left because he is the second oldest son. Third child overall, but second oldest son. The association, the Powerboat Association, when I was talking about them banning aircraft engines, they also banned hydroplane style hulls and limited engines to 625 cubic inches of piston displacement. So really it was limiting the types of boats that Gar was racing. So Wood kind of became uninterested in the Gold Cup and focused his attention more on international competitions. In 1920, he won the International Harmsworth Trophy in England, becoming an American hero. The Harmsworth Cup, or trophy, was the first international award for motorboat racing. At first, it was just a race of nation versus nation, with the boats and drivers all being produced wholly in the country represented. And in fact, if you won the cup, the race would then be held in your country the next year. So Gar would go on to win the Harmsworth Cup 9 times as an owner, and 8 of those 9 times he was the driver of the boats, and contributed to an unbroken American winning streak between 1920 and 1933. It was during this time that Chris Smith and Gar Wood went their separate ways. Chris Smith would go on to found Chris Craft and work on to create recreational speedboats, and Gar would form Gar Wood Inc. So part of the reason for Gar's success was the Miss America boats. He introduced the first one in 1920 for the Harmsworth Cup. So, known for his preparedness, Gar had brought both Miss America 1 and Miss Detroit 5 to the race. Miss America was better suited for smooth seas, and Miss Detroit was better for rough water conditions. The Brits had expected that Gar would bring the latter, and so chose to race on a day that had flat water. Gar was just kind of like, oh, well, and started unwrapping Miss America, and it was kind of a surprise to them. And Miss America went on to win the race, and Miss Detroit came in second. So they completely shut out the Brits entirely. Miss Detroit and Miss America boats were stepped hydroplanes, as were all the succeeding Miss America boats. They were built by Napolisi, who in a period of 16 years had designed and built 30 of the most influential, most influential famous race boats of all time. A step bottom works by creating a low pressure area as water flows past the step. As the velocity of the water flow past the hull increases, the pressure immediately behind the step decreases, which is what draws air in and distributes it along the bottom of the hull, allowing for increased speed. Also called transverse notches, steps reduce wetted surface at high speeds, thereby reducing frictional resistance. These boats were known for their crazy incredible speed, but that they were also difficult to handle and unpredictable at those high speeds. But Gar's Miss America set and broke numerous records, and he became a celebrity and known worldwide as the Silver Fox for his speed and his prematurely graying hair. The danger of hydroplanes became apparent in 1928 when Miss America 6 was completing its test run on the St. Clair River near Algonac, Michigan, in preparation for that year's Harmsworth Cup. The boat was approaching 100 miles per hour when it disintegrated around Gar and onboard mechanic Orland Johnson, nosediving into the river. Gar was virtually unharmed, but Orland suffered a number of injuries, including a broken jaw. The cause of the incident was never determined, though it's suspected that the two Packard engines were too big for the 26-foot boat. The boat itself was a total loss. Wood, from his hospital room, told Knapp Lacey to build him another one, and the Cup was just 17 days away. The engines were fished out of the bottom of the river, and Knapp installed them on a new hull that was 2 feet longer than the previous boat. In under 17 days, he delivered Miss America 7, just in time for Gar to defend the Cup. Gar would be racing Betty Carstairs and publicly expressed disappointment that he was being challenged by a woman. Miss America 7 ended up winning the race when Carstairs' boat, Estelle 2, capsized on the first lap. If you are interested in learning more about Betty Carstairs and other female racers of the 20th century, that is the subject of our next History at Home, which will be taking place on March 15th. So if you are interested in that, please do sign up. After the Harmsworth Cup, about a month later, Miss America 7 broke the world speed record at 92.82 miles per hour. Miss America 7's magnificent run would end in 1929 in Venice, however, when Gar's brother Phil and Orland Johnson were racing when the boat hit something, which launched it 30 feet into the air before it came crashing back down. Phil and Johnson were rescued by Miss America 5's crew, and Johnson reportedly almost died in the crash. Gar did not rest on the success of Miss America. He immediately built Miss America 8, which was a near exact replica of 7. He raced Miss America 9 in the 1930 Harmsworth Cup, but was disqualified along with Kay Dawn of England for crossing the starting line early. It was the only Harmsworth he ever lost as a driver. He still won by virtue of being the owner of the winning boat, Miss America 8, which was driven by his brother George and kept the cup in America. He became the fastest man on water, along with Johnson, when Miss America 9 became the first boat to reach 100 miles an hour, topping out at 102.256 miles per hour in 1931. Miss America 9 is the only one of the 3 remaining Americas, 8, 9, and 10, to still make regular appearances on water. It was preserved/restored by Charles Mistel. He did replace the bottom of the boat, and when he found it, there were no engines, but he left the hull sides with their original mahogany and paint, scrapes and chips, and dings in place. According to him, Gar Wood put those dings there, so he wasn't going to mess with them. Charles did pass away in 2020, and I'm unsure of what the family and his heirs are going to be doing with the boat, but it is still out there. Gar set out to make more history with Miss America 10. It was called the Madman's Dream. 10 weighed 7.5 tons, was 38 feet long, and had a 10-foot beam. It could also hold 300 gallons of gas. It featured 4 Packard 12-cylinder engines, which you can see in the photo there. While it was incredibly fast and its speed was unrivaled, it also had trouble with corners. On the St. Clair River at Algonac, Michigan in 1932, Gar broke the world speed record by averaging 124.86 miles per hour and became the first boat to clock 2 miles a minute. So, incredibly fast boat. 2 of Gar's most well-known races weren't even against other boats, but rather trains. In 1920, Gar had built a 50-foot cruiser known as the Gar Junior 2. It had a removable hardtop and windshield for racing. He pulled off a media stunt when he raced the famous express train, the Havana Special, from Miami to New York City in the Gar Junior 2, a trip that the train usually made in under 48 hours. Despite weather conditions that forced him to go 25 miles offshore, Gar and the Gar Junior 2 beat the train to New York City by 21 minutes, clocking in at 47 hours and 23 minutes. He repeated this stunt later in 1925 when one of the Miss America boats beat the 20th Century Limited train from Albany to New York City by 22 minutes. So Gar firmly believed that part of his success was due to 2 little good luck charms. So Merlin Wood had gifted her husband a pair of small bears early on in his career. Gar secured them to the steering column of his boat and went on to win the race that he was about to compete in. After, he said that the two bears must have brought him luck and thought that their presence was the difference between winning and finishing second. He named them Teddy and Bruin and was convinced that he needed the bears with him in order to win. He only forgot them once, and he did not win that race, further cementing their status to him as good luck. When Miss America 7, or excuse me, when Miss America 6 had its accident, Wood thought that the bears were responsible for saving him and Orland Johnson from certain death. The divers who were recovering the Packard engines from the bottom of the river were also instructed to recover the steering column because the bears were still attached to it. After that, Merlin Wood sewed them two tiny little life jackets, which you can see in the pictures here. Gar always believed that they were a critical element to his success. And just a few years ago, the bears sold to a private collector, so I'm not sure exactly who owns them now, but those would be a great and wonderful piece for A&E Museum. So if that person is listening, I do highly suggest that you donate them so that people can see them. But they're wonderful. Gar's success in racing made him very well known, which only aided in Gar Wood Inc.'s boat division selling watercraft for the discriminating customer. So it was kind of described as like Chris Crafts were, more affordable for people, most of them, but Gar's boats were more for the discriminating and discerning customer. So there was a demand for boats, and so Gar had the Baby Gar made. It was also made in response to the Powerboat Association's new rules that we talked about against hydroplanes racing in the Gold Cup. The boat came in two lengths, a 28-foot and a 33-foot. Baby Gar boats were outfitted with Liberty aircraft engines that Gar had modified for marine use. So after the war, and if you were on a rum running discussion last month, we talked about how those engines were so cheap that you could get them for pennies, literally. So Gar bought about 4,500 of these engines after the war, and for a very low price, and then he would soon modify them for marine use, and then they became very highly valued themselves, and so people would like to purchase a Gar Wood Liberty for their own boats. So those were the engines that he was putting into the Baby Gars. The first Baby Gar hulls were produced by Chris Smith, but eventually the two had a falling out, and Napolisi and George Joachim became Gar's builders and designers. From 1922 to 1933, Baby Gars were produced. The cost of a new one in 1924 was about $12,000. That was 3 times the cost of a 3-bedroom home at the time, making these boats the ultimate millionaire gentleman's toy. Notable owners, and you'll probably recognize a few of these last names. Notable owners include John Dodge, William Randolph Hearst, Benjamin Guinness, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Norman Woolworth, Philip Wrigley, and Robert Ringling. There were an original 67 Baby Gars sold, and then shortly after, Gar introduced the 26-foot Baby Gar Jr., which sold 103 units. In 1929, the Algonac plant was too small to meet demand, and so a new plant was built in Marysville, Michigan in 1930. And then if you look here on your screen, you'll see this ad. This ad was placed by Howard Lyon for the Baby Gars. So Howard Lyon was a really interesting fellow. Basically told Gar that, hey, if you can build them, I'm going to sell them. I can sell these boats. And so this was one of his marketing ploys, was to take out this ad, and it says the highest class runabout in the world. And then he goes on to list all of the gentlemen who in the world who already owned these boats, and they were the wealthiest and most influential men at the time. So if you got one of these boats, theoretically you also too were one of these wealthy and powerful men. So that was his kind of marketing ploy. He would eventually go on himself to come up with his own boat called the Sea Lion. And then I just really like this photo here because it kind of shows the rivalry between Chris Craft and Gar Wood. This was taken in 1930 at the Miami Beach races in Miami, Florida. But I just think it's a great photo of like sportsmanship and rivalry. It's a good photo. So Gar retired from racing in 1932 after he set that world speed record. His son Gar Jr. kept up the family racing tradition. That's a photo of him there in 1936. Gar became more involved in Gar Wood Industries, which at the time was being overseen by his brother Logan, and he was really anticipating retiring within a few years. In the 1930s, the company did branch out into the furnace business when Gar was trying to find a furnace builder for his own home and couldn't find one he liked. So he's like, well, we're just going to go ahead and make one. So they did that. They also branched out into construction equipment and for a brief time, the bus industry. On the whole, the company did very well during the Great Depression. From 1934 to 1936, the company's sales doubled from 4.7 million to 9.4 million. So they didn't do too badly. Unfortunately, Logan Wood passed away in 1938, which kind of delayed Gar's plans for retiring, so he stayed involved with the business just a few more years. So in 1941, before the formal entry of the United States into the war, Gar did retire from business, and he had disposed of that 3/4 of all the stock in the company that he had, and served as chairman rather than president. The Marysville plant focused on production of target boats and military tugboats starting in 1942 for the war effort. The hoist company, as it had in World War I, continued to produce hoists for the dump trucks that the U.S. Army and all of the branches were using at the time, and their sales hit new records thanks to the war. Gar had also worked with the U.S. Navy to develop a PT boat, which was loosely based on the Gar Jr. 2, that 50-foot cruiser that he raced the train to in a couple years before. Gar was too old to fight during the war, but you'll notice that there's a registration card up on your screen, and that's because he signed up for the Civil Air Patrol. He, in addition to being a race boat enthusiast, he also flew his own plane. So he piloted a plane up and down the Atlantic coast, patrolling the waters and the airfield surrounding the country. In 1944, Gar was struck by lightning on an airfield in Miami, and he was completely unharmed. He only had a cut above his eye that he had received from falling against an airplane after he had been struck by that lightning. So, again, most interesting man in the world gets struck by lightning. He bought Fisher Island in Florida in 1946, which was formerly the hideaway for the Vanderbilt family. It was accessible only by plane, boat, or ferry. Today, it's a private island with hotels, apartments, mansions, and it's one of the richest islands in the world. It's very exclusive. The original house has been split up into 15 accommodations, so you can kind of see it in the center of the picture there. So you've got a massive boathouse, and then you got the smaller building, which is the house. So it's split up into different accommodations, and one of the additions that Gar made, called the Gar Wood Lounge, is actually a restaurant now that you can go in and eat at. So also part of the war effort, in 1944, the Air Force commissioned Gar to build the Venturi. It was a 120-ton twin-hulled plywood ship that was 188 feet long. He received $350,000 to make it happen. It was launched on November 14th, 1944, but because the war ended shortly thereafter, it wasn't ever really used. So Gar bought it back from the government for $25,000 and then spent an additional $600,000 outfitting it as a super luxury yacht. It had 4 16-cylinder diesel engines that were capable of producing 4,800 horsepower. And what made this boat kind of cool was that instead of climbing over waves like standard holds, the Venturi sliced through them, minimizing pitching and the loss of speed. It also would resist rolling, so if it was forcibly tilted by something, it kind of righted itself. And his hope was that this would become like a commercially viable super luxury yacht, but it didn't because there was an accident in 1954. Gar was at the helm, and they were off the coast of Fisher Island when the boat sank. It was during a storm, and it just according to Gar, it kind of disintegrated around them. He said that had the boat been made out of steel, it would have most likely survived, but he thought that the wood had become kind of brittle over time, and that's why it disintegrated. But according to him, the bulkheads did their job, which allowed the boat to float for 3 hours while they waited for help. The deck, which normally was about 20 feet above the water, was 5 feet above the water by the time they were rescued. So it did float for quite a while. And the only injury reported was one of the young ladies that was with pulled a leg muscle as she was moving from the Venturi to the rescue boat. Gar Wood Industries continued to produce boats after the war. In fact, from February 1946 to 1947, they built more boats than in any other period in their history, about 900 hulls. Since traditional wood materials that had been used were in short supply due to the war, a new line of boats were all painted rather than having the varnished mahogany hulls. Rumors sprang up that the paint was to hide poor workmanship, and that's all that ever was rumors, but people like to gossip. Our museum actually does have a rare example of a varnished post-war wood-hulled runabout from 1946 on display at our museum. So if you're interested in seeing one of those, please do visit the museum. The boats themselves were also expensive to produce. Gar had always protected the boat division from the corporate executives in his company and was able to hide the losses of the boat division by other divisions. So he wasn't exactly hiding them, but they weren't as noticeable because the other parts of the Gar Wood Industries were making so much money. But all in all, the boat sales at Gar Wood Inc. never really amounted to more than 3% of the company's sales ever. Like, that's all they ever were. So it wasn't really a profitable venture for them, regardless of them being well known. So when Gar retired, allegedly the executives, who had also thought that they were being neglected and not paid well, exacted their revenge and closed the boat division in 1947. And it didn't matter that they were still considered among the finest in the world and excellent examples of craftsmanship. They just weren't making money. And so they made the business decision to close that division. Estimates vary for the number of hulls built by Gar Wood Industries. Some place it at around 3,300, while others estimate it's more around the $10,000 mark. Of those, however, roughly 300 to 500 still exist. They are much sought after as their quality and workmanship speak for themselves. Gar, after Merlin died, she died in 1948. So he lived alone on the 230-acre Fisher Island with staff, and then he had daytime mechanical engineers who would visit him daily, and they would tinker and design and come up with new ideas. Even into his old age, he was still innovating. Well into his 80s, and rumors swirled that he was working on a commercially feasible battery-powered electric automobile, and that people could see it like puttering around the island. He finally revealed his design and prototype to the world in 1967 in an issue of Popular Mechanics. He called it the Gar Wood Super Electric Model A. It was nearly 10 feet long and 450 pounds, and it was run by 8 12-volt batteries, which themselves were 520 pounds. So it was it was just under 1,000 pounds of weight. The batteries could be recharged for a cost of about 20 cents and powered two specifically designed 90-volt 2 horsepower DC motors. Its top speed was 52 miles an hour, and he hoped that he could market this innovation for under $1,500. And in that time, in 1967, the average cost of a car was about $2,700. So this would have been a more affordable option to a lot of people. It really was, though, an accomplishment ahead of his time and way ahead of the battery technology needed for one of these to become commercially viable. Garfield Arthur Wood passed away on June 19, 1971, at the age of 90 from stomach cancer. He left behind his son, grandson, and granddaughter, as well as an extensive list of accomplishments. There are too many to name, but at one time he held more patents than anyone living in the world, won the Harmsworth Cup 9 times, and set the world speed water record 5 times. And he was crazy enough to race a train with a boat twice. His company would eventually be broken up and sold to various other companies, with the last of Gar Wood's original designs being available to consumers until the mid-1990s. And I just want to wrap this up with a quote of Gar Wood's. It really encapsulates who he was to me and what he was at heart. Boat racing is a mechanics game. I guess that's why I like it. To the end, he was a tinkerer and an innovator and a person who liked to design and be creative. And that's kind of why he likes speedboats, because figuring out how to make it go faster was a matter of tinkering with the right parts. Thank you for joining us for this week's History at Home. We hope you'll continue to join us as the Douglas County Museum and the Runestone Museum continue to present these classes to the public. Thank you again.